There we go. Thank you all so much for joining us for today's event on Maine's climate adaptation costs and holding the fossil fuel industry accountable for their share of the climate damages. We are so excited to be co-hosting this event today with Conservation Law Foundation, Union of Concerned Scientists, and the Center for Climate Integrity. We are also joined by a suite of amazing speakers that will be introduced to you all shortly. My name is Abby Bradford. I am Maine Conservation Alliance's Outreach Manager. And you can go to the next slide, please, Sean. MCA protects Maine's environment by engaging Maine people in democracy, by building diverse coalitions, and educating candidates, elected officials, and the public on policy solutions to advance Maine's environmental priorities. A few technical notes for today's event. And you can go to the agenda slide, Sean. You are all muted, but we do want to hear from you. Please send your questions and comments to me, Abby, through the chat as they occur to you. You can find that by hovering your mouse over the bottom of your screen. I'll keep track of your questions to send to the speakers during the Q&A session at the end of today's event. Today's event is being recorded and the video will be shared with you all later today. So feel free to turn off your video if you would like to enjoy your lunch off camera. Thank you all so much again for joining us, and I will turn it over to our other MC for the day, Sean Mahoney, Executive Vice President and Director of Conservation Law Foundation.
Great, good afternoon, everybody. And let me also thank Maine Conservation Voters and Abby for all their work in pulling this great panel together. And I think we're just going to get right to it. We've got 5 great speakers that can talk about both local, state, and national issues and efforts around this. And we're lucky enough to start with Nellie Haldane, who it looks also, Nellie, like there are some other Haldanes on this phone call, which is great. So hopefully those are proud parents or siblings or whoever. And Nellie is a student at the University of Prince Edward Island, studying climate change mitigation and adaptation. She was raised in Blue Hill and is working with her community again on their sea level rise issues. So with that, I'm just going to kick it right to Nellie.
Thank you. Yeah, so I was asked to be a member of the Sea Level Rise Task Force for Blue Hill, and that was over the summer, and we were basically charged with creating a plan for Blue Hill for the future in terms of climate change and sea level rise, because we're really at risk here on the coast. And so there were 3 other members, another college student and 2 concerned community members. And so, as you can see here, thank you, Sean. That was good. You can go back. Yeah. So the wharf in town and in South Blue Hill, this is where most of the lobstermen go out from the Blue Hill area. And at high tides and at king tides and storm surges, this goes underwater, which is not very effective for a wharf. So we created a plan of what to do when this happens and what to avoid it in the future. And it identifies the most vulnerable areas, which are, as you can see, these wharves and the water treatment facility, which is actually just off to the side of the right photo here, which is only a foot above high tide. So it's a little bit at risk there. And we determined what the town could do in the future, and it wasn't funded, so we don't have a lot of cost estimates. It was just a few members giving our time voluntarily, so we didn't hire an engineer or anything, but we did identify multiple grants and funding opportunities that the town can pursue. So yeah, if you want to go to the next slide there. Yeah, as you can see, erosion is also an issue that the town is facing. This is at the town park, and along the coastline of the town bay, there is a lot of erosion that is happening. So one part of the report was talking about mitigation strategies that we could use to stop erosion or sea level rise or sea level intrusion. So that's another option. And then on the right here, you can see some attempt to stop the erosion happening at the Seaside Cemetery. And so that is what that photo is. It's not super great, but I think that was probably a private job that someone did. But yeah, so again, about the costs, we have a hesitant number of $60,000 for an initial comprehensive vulnerability assessment. And that's based on Stonington's costs. We worked closely with them because they have an assessment done. And we also discussed with the wastewater treatment plant, they're coming up with their own plan. So we were hesitant to really do any official numbers and cost estimates because they may have their own that they're doing as well. So we don't have anything official, but we are hopeful that the town will pursue other options and make a plan so that we do not get bombarded by climate change and sea level rise in the future. And that's all I have, so we can move on.
That's great, Nellie. Thank you so much. And as you mentioned, there are a number of communities that are doing this, not just Blue Hill and Stonington, Vinyl Haven, Old Orchard Beach. It's up and down the coast, and it's really an important aspect of the resilience and adaptation efforts that the state is going to have to engage in going forward. And of course, one of the reasons that we are having to engage in these efforts is because of, it's the root cause is climate change. And we're lucky enough to have two folks from the Center for Climate Integrity talk to us today a little bit about the background of those who are most responsible for climate change, and particularly when we're talking about energy, that goes to the oil and gas companies. So next up, we've got Megan Matthews, who's a research and policy associate with the Center for Climate Integrity, who has spent a lot of time researching and tracking the decades of misinformation and outright lies at the heart of the climate disaster. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Megan, who's talking to us from DC. Welcome, Megan.
Yeah, thank you, Sean, and thank you, Nellie, for all of the work that you do to protect your community. As Sean said, one of the most sobering facts about that is that it shouldn't be necessary, that we are in the situation that we're in because of decades of climate inaction rooted in denial and deception by the fossil fuel industry. So today I'm going to take you on a very quick sprint through the decades-long campaign of denial and deception that the fossil fuel industry ran in an attempt to protect their profits. If you want to go to the next slide, Sean. And the next slide probably as well. They knew as early as the 1960s that their products would lead to climate change and that would have disastrous impacts. The link between CO2 emissions and a warming climate was actually established back in the 19th century, but by the middle of the 20th century, the industry was starting to pay attention as the link between the burning of fossil fuels, increased atmospheric CO2, and eventual warming was becoming more clear. In the 1965 annual meeting of the American Petroleum Institute, which is the industry's largest trade association, their president, Frank Ickard, warned all of the companies in attendance that a recent report coming from President Johnson's office at the time warned that burning of fossil fuels could make marked changes in our climate that could potentially be so large that by 2000 they would have to start looking for alternative fuels. So the industry was definitely on notice in the 1960s, and they started looking into this issue themselves. In 1968, you can see a report from the Stanford Research Institute, which produced the report at the request of the American Petroleum Institute, and this report concluded that based on reasonable emission assumptions that there would be warming that could had no doubt would have a severe environmental impact. With this information, the companies started to look into it with their own internal scientists. In 1982, you can see an internal Exxon memo that lays out that the science Exxon was doing at the time completely aligned with the broader scientific consensus that burning of fossil fuels would lead to increased atmospheric CO2, and that increased atmospheric CO2 would have a measurable and significant impact on our climate. And part of what's most interesting about this 1982 memo is that it concludes with the idea that while it might be weird for Exxon to publish research about the harms of their products, they had an ethical credo and responsibility to do so, which is kind of astounding to think back about now. If you go to the next slide, Sean, please. So as you can see from this testimony from a former Exxon scientist, within the company, the question was not whether there would be a problem if CO2 could cause climate change, but how soon, how bad, and how fast the problem would be. And as they dug into the question of how bad it would be, they got a resounding answer in the early 1980s, predicting that the effects would be catastrophic 3 times over. In 1980, a group of scientists brought together from these companies by the American Petroleum Institute concluded that by 2067, the world could expect to see a 5-degree temperature rise based on expected emissions that would lead to globally catastrophic effects. In 1981, Exxon scientist Roger Cohen was asked to review a note from their corporate planning department that concluded that the CO2 emissions would have an impact on Earth's climate, but they would probably fall well short of catastrophic. Cohen pushes back and says that that statement is too reassuring and that indeed there is a real possibility that there would be catastrophic impacts, at least for a substantial fraction of the Earth's population. And then again in 1982, we have another memo that was circulated internally within Exxon detailing all the potential effects of CO2 emissions and climate change, and concludes that there are several potentially catastrophic effects that must be considered, including the flooding of DC and the state of Florida from the melting of polar ice caps. Next slide, Sean. So the oil industry management did not just sit on these findings, and they started to prepare their own assets for this warming world. On the left, you can see a New York Times article about a Shell decision to raise one of their drilling rigs at increased cost in order to account for sea level rise in the coming decades. And companies also started to submit patents that would work in a warming and melting Arctic. So if you go to the next slide, if you put it all together, it's very clear that by the late 1980s, the oil industry had a deep understanding of climate change. They established this consensus, their own scientists confirmed that's what their research lined up with. They predicted what the impacts would be, catastrophic across the board, and they started to prepare their own assets. But instead of warning the public and leading the transition to clean energy, they lied. Go to the next slide. And this pivot that we see in their actions and in their statements about climate change really starts in 1988, which happens to be the year that James Hansen testified before Congress that the greenhouse effect was now observable. It's also the year that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was convened, and the year that President George H.W. Bush said that he would answer the greenhouse effect with the White House effect. So in 1988, climate action was coming, and the oil industry pivoted. As you can see in this internal document from Exxon, their new position was to establish the uncertainty in the scientific conclusions about the greenhouse effect. You can also see above in that document that they would provide leadership and kind of direct the direction of the industry as a whole and how they talked about climate change. Go to the next slide. So here are some of like the public campaigns that you start to see in response to this new position. On the left, you see advertorials that Mobil was famous for, where they would take out an advertising spot in the New York Times and make an ad that looked like an editorial where they would bemoan climate action or potential treaties like the Kyoto Protocol. In the middle, there is an ad campaign that was run by the Information Council for the Environment, also sometimes referred to as the Informed Citizens for the Environment, which was pulled together by a group of coal companies, but major oil and gas companies had a lot of coal holdings at the time, where they, as you can see, just completely questioned the validity of climate science and encouraged people who were interested in the issue to write to them and ask for more information. And then you can see, again, another excellent publication questioning or proposing a debate on the science of global warming and what they should do about it. If you go to the next slide. Next slide. Sorry. There were also, in addition to these public campaigns, working behind the scenes. On the left, you can see, oh, back one. On the left, you can see, back one, sorry. Okay, perfect. So Shell, again, had adopted Exxon's proposal that they push uncertainty about climate scientists, despite the fact that they had decades of research by their own scientists confirming that climate change was real. And they laid out a plan to insert these ideas into different IPCC proceedings, the UNFCCC, and into academic institutions. On the right, you can see an invoice from known climate denier, Dr. Willie Soon, to Exxon in 2008 for funding for a study on a theory that Exxon had already debunked. So the fossil fuel industry was pushing this campaign on all ends, from a public lens, from just communications, funding junk science, and trying to get it placed into IPCC and UNFCCC proceedings. And if this all sounds like a massive coordinated campaign, I'm very confident in confirming that it is, and that's because we have the plan. This is an internal API memo from their Global Climate Science Communications team. And it's often known as the victory memo because, as you can see on the left, they define victory as average citizens understanding the uncertainties in climate science. The quotes around understanding are doing a lot of work here. It's clear that even API knew that understanding had two meanings in this context. And then another we're doing a lot of work is uncertainties. And that's because it wasn't necessary for the oil industry to convince you that climate change wasn't real for them to be successful. They just had to say enough to make you doubt it, to allow for delay. And they were massively successful in stopping climate action and in having this doubt penetrate through all sectors of society. It is interesting that just yesterday, our Supreme Court nominee testified before the Senate that she could not comment on whether climate change was real because it was a matter of public debate. And I'm sure I don't have to establish for anyone on this call that climate change is not a matter of public debate. It is well grounded and established in science, but the oil industry has been so successful in pushing this uncertainty that we are still dealing with it all these years later in 2020. So Big Oil's campaign of denial and deception was the most consequential in history, but it wasn't necessarily unprecedented. If this campaign of denial and deception sounds a little bit familiar to you, and maybe reminds you of the tobacco industry's denial and deception, you'd be absolutely right. These two industries were using the same exact playbook. They had a strong relationship, the oil industry and the tobacco industry, due to their similar interest in understanding air pollution and studying the effects going back to the early 20th century. They also had similar commercial interests, with cigarettes being sold at gas stations and making up a large part of those sales. So they developed this playbook of denial and deception together, often using the same PR companies, the same strategies, the same messaging to sow doubt and denial into the public conscious. And even today, we see that a lot of the trade associations and oil industry representatives who come to their defense in climate litigation cases also have ties back to the tobacco industry. And I think this is an important point to make because there are definitely lessons to be learned from the tobacco litigation. If we were able to hold the tobacco industry accountable, hopefully we can do the same for the oil industry.
Perfect segue, Megan. Thanks so much. Because our next speaker is Jamie Kilbreth. And for better or worse, Jamie's probably one of the biggest reasons why I came to the state of Maine to practice law about 25 years ago. Jamie was a former deputy attorney general for Maine, and then for many years a partner at Haldane, and now at Drummond Woodsum. And Jamie was the lead counsel in the state of Maine's efforts against the tobacco companies back in the late 90s, early 2000s, and I was lucky enough to be able to work with him on that. So over to Jamie for a little bit of exposition on that tobacco industry approach and how it's reflected with the big oil approach. You're on mute, Jamie. This is the kind of stuff I had to do when I was at Haldane with Jamie.
There you go. I had to unmute myself. I thought Abby was in charge. Anyway, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks, Sean, and thanks, Megan. I think Megan largely described the approach of the tobacco industry, and let me just focus on a few things. Going back really into even the 40s and 50s, the tobacco industry had information about both the negative health effects of smoking and the addictiveness of nicotine. And for a while, you could argue that there was some conflicting evidence. It wasn't certain, but it certainly, by the 50s and 60s, became very clear. There were studies that the tobacco industry did on the addictive qualities of nicotine and experiments they did to enhance the amount of nicotine a smoker would get in smoking. And they did that in the form of the way they structured filters, and also in the form of additives to the product, like ammonia. And they did the same thing tobacco, as Megan was describing, as they had three basic arguments. One was, well, there's no real conclusive link between smoking and diseases like cancer or heart disease. They also claimed that they were committed to research on the health effects to make sure that smoking was safe. At different times, they promoted claims like smoking is good for you because it makes you relax and it soothes your throat, or some, similarly wrong-headed notions. But the principal thing they claimed was that smoking was not addictive. And you may remember, I was trying to find this picture because I would have loved to put it up, but they had 7 tobacco company executives testify in front of Congress that nicotine was not addictive, and they all raised their hands and swore under oath. And it was really a fairly dramatic moment and a powerful turning point in the way a lot of people, I think, ended up thinking about tobacco. They did the same kinds of things that Megan was describing. They had a massive advertising campaign about smoking with Joe Camel, and lots of ways they tried to encourage young people to smoke. I think one of the interesting fights they had was at the FDA. They tried to claim that smoking was something people did for pleasure and it wasn't to get a nicotine hit. And around 1994, the head of the FDA, David Kessler, put out a paper suggesting the FDA was going to look into regulating tobacco as a nicotine delivery device so that it was a subject to FDA regulation as a medical device. And that's one of the contexts in which all these arguments about nicotine wasn't addictive, et cetera, went on. And a big part of their campaign was that it was individual choice. And that was the contrast to whether it was actually an addictive drug. The two things that are also similar, I think, involve the use of these sort of PR institutes. Megan was talking about the API. The industry created a thing called the Tobacco Institute, and they were responsible for a lot of the so-called research that was done into the health effects of smoking. And they tried to set this all up through lawyers so they could claim attorney-client privilege and keep the information suppressed. We had and naturally there were a lot of experiments, both with dogs and with mice, that established that smoking had substantial health consequences. And particularly with mice, there was cancers that were developed in these various smoking experiments. That research is all suppressed. It wasn't, and like the Exxon papers and some of these other things, it wasn't until there was litigation that it began to come out. And I think it'd be worth Sean describing one aspect of this that we were involved in that involved actually Jackson Labs and mice experiments. And a researcher named Dr. Hamburger, who had a smoking machine in which he loaded smoke into mice, and they established pretty clearly that the mice developed cancer. So Sean, why don't you talk a little about that, because you ended up dealing with it.
It's a little, so the Jackson Lab, as most people know, is a research place that has developed strains of mice that are used for testing all over the world. And the tobacco industry funded a great deal of research at Jackson Lab back in the 50s and 60s, including this work by Dr. Hamburger, who had developed a smoking machine that looked like a kind of a chicken feed tube that would have individual tubes that would be put into mice and then smoke forced into them. And his research clearly showed that that led to cancerous tumors, a variety of cancerous tumors on mice. And that research was absolutely squashed. He was blacklisted from further research. He actually had a home in Trenton, and they continued to live there and also work in Massachusetts. But his research, like a lot of the Exxon and oil companies, was subject to non-disclosure agreements and lawyers, and he was prevented from doing anything. We actually found out about him in doing some research, and we actually tracked him down to his home in Massachusetts, in Brookline, and then to his son's house in Wellesley, where his smoking machine he had kept. So this machine that was 25, 30 years old, we literally brought to light from his basement for the first time in decades, and had the real pleasure, for the lawyers on the call, had the real pleasure of unveiling that at a deposition of the tobacco companies that we were taking in Boston. And it was a real, it's one of those gotcha movements that happens in the movies, but never really happens in real life. But it was a great moment. But it does get to the parallels between the two industries are very, very strong. And, you know, I guess, you know, Jamie, unless you've got anything you want to add, I'll move on to Corey.
Well, I was just going to add one thing, which I think may tie into what Corey's going to talk about, but the theory of the litigation eventually, it grew out of lots of individual cases against tobacco companies for people who had gotten cancer and were largely unsuccessful. And eventually, the theory was a sort of Medicaid fraud theory brought by initially Mississippi and then 3 or 4 other states, and eventually about 35 states. And the theory was that because the tobacco companies had lied and misled the public about the addictive qualities of nicotine and the consequences of smoking, they should be held to account for the costs incurred by the states for treating people for those illnesses. And I think what is the most perhaps relevant about all that is that what really turned the tide on that and made the settlements possible was collecting these documents like the ones Megan went through.
Right.
There was just an avalanche of those that eventually came out, and it made it impossible for the industry to defend itself. So hopefully that is something that will become much more resonant as more things come out with the public in the context of big oil.
Yeah, that's a great segue, Jamie, and for Corey. Corey is a staff attorney at the Center for Climate Integrity and is working on a couple of these cases that he's going to talk about in a second. Prior to that, he'd been an environmental lawyer in San Francisco and is now, and previously with a youth climate organization doing engagement in Eugene, Oregon, where he's talking to us today. So appreciate Corey getting up early to join us on the East Coast, and over to you, Corey.
Thanks, Sean. So I'm going to give a high-level summary of the climate liability lawsuits that have been filed thus far, touching on their facts, cause of action, the remedies being sought, as well as just a quick update about where things stand. I'll drop my email in the chat when I'm done. Feel free to follow up with any questions you may have that don't get addressed here today. So at the outset, I just want to make clear that neither myself nor CCI are actually litigating any of these cases. While we're supportive of the plaintiffs in the cases, we do not represent or speak for any of them. The municipality and state plaintiffs are more than ably represented by their own in-house lawyers and some of the top private plaintiff law firms in the country. So, so far from coast to coast, 18 municipalities, 5 states, the District of Columbia, and the Pacific Coast Federation of Fishermen's Association have all filed lawsuit against the world's largest investor-owned fossil fuel companies. While these cases are brought under various causes of action, which I'll get into in a minute, meaning they have different elements the plaintiffs will have to prove and may result in different remedies, the theory of liability underlying all these cases is remarkably similar. And that is that the big oil defendants knew the harm their products would cause. They lied to us all about it. The harm they internally projected and predicted has come to bear, and now they should pay for it. These cases have been brought under one or more of 3 different theories. First, common law tort claims, including nuisance, trespass, and negligence. And you can see on the slide on the screen, we've delineated out which claims each case brought. Product liability claims, either design defect or failure to warn. And then, like many of the recent state cases, under consumer protection statutes. The tort claims, or we call them cost recovery lawsuits, they seek damages in the amount of what it is the municipalities and states are going to need to spend to remedy and bring about adaptation changes that are a result of the harm caused by the climate crisis. In the consumer protection cases, the climate fraud lawsuits, they're seeking damages available to the plaintiff under that state's consumer protection statute. And that sometimes includes restitution, civil penalties, treble damages, and even court orders to have the companies end all their unfair and deceptive trade practices. So as Jamie mentioned and Sean mentioned, these lawsuits follow a successful litigation model seen in Maine and across the country, most notably in the tobacco cases, but also in the recent opioid litigation we're seeing in Maine and around the country. They also MTBE, PCB, PFAS, those nuisance cases where the groundwater contamination. Like these other mass tort and fraud cases, these current climate liability lawsuits are premised on a very strong factual background. Again, Jamie alluded to this, and my colleague Megan detailed that even before these cases get to the discovery phase of the litigation, We know from these internal documents that were leaked and came out through investigations in 2015 that the big oil defendants orchestrated a decades-long campaign of deception, lying to the public about the harms that their products would cause us all. And I just want to note these internal documents are still being leaked and they're still damning. While some of the companies recently have been making a big show of trying to reduce their emissions. Documents that have just surfaced show that Exxon actually plans on increasing its emissions by 17% over the next 5 years, meaning Exxon alone could be responsible for the emission of another 100 million tons of additional carbon dioxide by 2025. So like Jamie said, these documents are continuing to come out and they're very powerful. Like many of those cases that came before, these cases are brought under established state law using the same public nuisance, fraud theories, consumer protection statutes. And like the cases, tobacco, opioid, and others that came before, if these plaintiffs here in the climate liability lawsuits are successful, municipal and state agencies will get the money they desperately need to remedy the harms done. As Nellie previously touched on, I think Rachel will touch on next, and as I'm sure you're all aware, Maine is facing very expensive climate adaptation costs in the very near future. A massive gap will soon exist between these costs as compared to the municipal and state budgets. So at their core, these lawsuits are simply about deciding who should make up that gap. The companies that lied and deceived and hid crucial knowledge about the harm their products would cause, or the taxpayers who did none of that. What these cases are not about is climate policy. So along with delay, the defendants in these cases, their primary strategy is to try to reshape these cases into something they're not, into cases about greenhouse gas regulation. And I want to be clear about this. These cases themselves are not about lowering greenhouse gas emission, rather they're about defendants' deception and remedying the harm that that deception has caused. Thus far, the litigation in all these cases follows a similar pattern. The plaintiffs file their case in state court under state law. The defendants then remove the case from state court to federal court, where they aim to convert plaintiffs' state law claims into federal law claims and then argue that the federal law claims are displaced by the Clean Air Act. The good news is all but one district court have remanded these cases back to state court. And thus far, the 4th, 10th, and 9th Circuits of Appeal have upheld those remand decisions. A decision from the 1st Circuit in the Rhode Island case is expected soon. So I'll just end just quickly looking at the slide that's on your screen. As you can see from the map, these cases are popping up across the country from Hawaii to Massachusetts, from the fishermen off the Oregon, California coast to Charleston, South Carolina. The wave of litigation is only growing. There were 4 new cases filed last month. There was another one filed in Maui just this week. And we expect to see more state and municipalities across the country join in, much like we saw with the tobacco and opioid litigation. Thanks, Sean.
Okay. Well, I will.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Corey. And great. So to close out the conversation today is Rachel Licker, who, as you can see from the slide, is a senior climate scientist at UCS in their climate and energy program. And Rachel conducts climate impacts and attribution research, communicates that climate science to policymakers and the public and the media, and I can't emphasize how important that is, and works to defend the science budgets and programs in the federal government, which we all know have been under assault for the last 4 years, and were underfunded anyways prior to the current administration. I'll refrain from saying anything else. So over to you, Rachel.
Thank you so much. And thank you for the opportunity to speak with you all today. I'm going to be speaking about the science that's relevant to the climate litigation that we've been talking about, and namely how we can attribute the climate impacts that we've been observing around us, including in Maine, to fossil fuel company products. And so where I wanted to start was here on this slide, with the fact that we attribute things all the time. We think about it, attribution all the time, whether it be tracing the role of subprime loans in the 2008 recession, or, the role of big pharma in the opioid crisis, or, even in ecology, figuring out how the use of DDT was causing the decline in the bald eagle population. So it's a concept that is really familiar to us. The next slide, please. And in climate science, we have started off kind of at this big level. What this is showing you here are graphs from climate models and their output of how global temperature has changed since pre-industrial times on the right. Or actually, let me start on the left, I should say. These are climate models that have been run using all different sources of forcings on global temperature, whether it be greenhouse gas emissions, volcanoes, solar activity, et cetera. And there is a dark line in black in the center, which is the observations. And you can see basically that all of the different climate models that have been run pretty tightly couple to the observed global temperature that these models have simulated. Now on the right, if you run all of those same models, but you take out human-caused greenhouse gas emissions, it produces this dark blue line, which that global temperature is obviously really different from that black line that goes up. So basically, this is kind of the first attribution that climate scientists were able to do to say, we are very confident that the Earth's temperature has been affected by human-caused greenhouse gas emissions. So next slide, please. And things have gotten increasingly granular. We have, started out at this really broad level. We then have been able to talk about the role of human-caused climate change in specific extreme events, and the probability that they would have occurred without those greenhouse gas emissions. And now science is shifting to be able to not just look at climate change resulting from all human-caused greenhouse gas emissions, it's also able to attribute changes to specific emission sources. So here I'm showing you a graph which in blue is all of the global carbon emissions from all fossil fuel producers and cement manufacturers since 1850 in millions of tons. And in red is just from the top 90 carbon producers. That work was published by Rick Heady, and he found that nearly 2/3 of all industrial carbon emissions, starting from the Industrial Revolution onward, can be traced to these 90 largest carbon producers. So these are investor-owned and state-owned fossil fuel companies like ExxonMobil, BP, Chevron, Royal Dutch Shell, Peabody Energy, Gazprom, Saudi Aramco, as well as cement manufacturers. And you can see that the vast majority of the emissions from these companies has occurred since that time period that we talked about previously, the 1960s or so, when companies started to know about the climate-related risks of their products. So next slide, please. Oh, sorry, this is a bit different than what mine look like. So I was just a little bit surprised. So my colleague, sorry, I just want to make sure that I'm talking about the right thing. There was a picture on mine that I didn't translate. So my colleague Brenda Eckwurzel at the Union of Concerned Scientists worked with colleagues to run a simple climate model with those emissions from the fossil fuel companies to calculate the amount of global average surface temperature and sea level rise that's tied to the emissions from those 90 carbon producers. And she found that the emissions from the extraction and production of those 90 major fossil fuel producers and cement manufacturers over that pre-industrial to present time period contributed about 42 to 50% of the global temperature rise that we've seen around the world. Next slide, please. And what this really means for Maine is, when we talk about global surface temperature change, we are not just talking about the surface of land surface, we're also talking about the ocean. And that's manifesting in changes for all of you, like the exceptional increase in temperatures that have been observed in the Gulf of Maine. Next slide, please. My colleague also looked at the increase in sea level rise that's attributable to these large carbon producers and found that about 26 to 32% of global sea level rise, again, between that pre-industrial to present time period, can be tied to the products from these corporations. Next slide, please. And again, coming back to Maine, this is manifested in observed sea level rise along the Gulf of Maine's coast, as the previous, our initial speaker showed you pictures of, and how that is actually playing out. The flooding events that impact families, businesses, and infrastructure along the coastline, that is the manifestation of this global sea level rise. Next slide, please. And we can also look at global ocean acidification, which has a well-known relationship with the concentration of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. So the top graph is showing you the concentration of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere, which has been marching up and up and up over time. And there's kind of this wiggle that is the basically Earth breathing in, the vegetation breathing the carbon dioxide in and then breathing it out in the winter. And then the bottom is showing you the pH of the surface of the ocean. And you can see it's a direct relationship. As it goes up in the atmosphere, the pH goes down because the ocean absorbs a huge amount of the excess carbon that gets put into the atmosphere from human greenhouse gas emissions. I kind of think of it like soda water. You add that, that carbon dioxide into water and it makes it more acidic. So next slide, please. So we looked at the emissions from now the 88 largest carbon producers. I referenced 90 before because we actually did a study last year where we looked at a slightly longer period and it added a few more years of data. And because of a few mergers and acquisitions there, we looked at the 88 largest carbon producers. And we looked at the amount of ocean acidification globally that can be tied to the emissions from these different carbon producers. We found that more than half globally of the decrease in ocean pH can be attributed to the largest carbon producers over this long time period back to pre-industrial. And we also looked at a more recent time period since 1965 when these companies knew about the climate-related harms of their products and didn't do anything. And we again found that more than half of the decrease in the ocean's pH can be tied to these large carbon producers. And what I'm showing you here is the portion of global ocean acidification that occurred since pre-industrial times as a result of the emissions from the top 20 investor-owned and majority state-owned companies. So the orange are the companies that are investor-owned. And again, these are the companies that had the possibility to tell their shareholders about the climate-related risks of their products, but didn't. And many of these companies are the ones that are currently the involved or the are part of and the target of the climate-related litigation. So next slide, please. I'm going to stop there and happy to take any questions that you have. Just wanted to give you my contact information and I will turn it back over. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much to all of our wonderful speakers. That was a lot of information into 40 minutes. So now we will turn to a Q&A to answer any questions that have arisen for you all. Please send your questions to me, Abby, through the chat, which again you can find at the bottom of your screen. While you brainstorm questions, I'm also going to make a plug for how you can get involved. In a follow-up email that you'll receive this afternoon with the video recording to this event will also include an action form that we'll send to your representatives in DC, asking them to help Maine's municipalities and taxpayers cover these climate adaptation costs we're facing by holding fossil fuel corporations accountable. That also includes a specific ask to block something called liability waivers which are something fossil fuel industry is trying to sneak into bills at the federal level to help make these kinds of suits impossible. I'm going to drop a link to that in the chat right now as well, but it'll also be in your email later today. And I know that we have a couple of questions teed up thus far, so I'll hand it back over to Sean to start asking.
Sure, this is a question probably first to Corey, but to the extent that to what extent is the litigation dependent on administration and or any change in administration? What would be the impacts there, and particularly on the federal end of it?
Well, we are still sort of researching and looking into that, but the short answer is not a ton. These cases are filed in state court. They are brought by attorneys generals and attorneys for the counties and cities. The defendants are, of course, all the oil industry, and now API has been named in a couple of lawsuits. What we've seen on the federal side thus far, unfortunately, but I guess not surprisingly, is the federal government, the Department of Justice, weighing in, filing amicus briefs on behalf of the defendant companies. So one thing we could see in a shift of administration is actually that same body, the Department of Justice, filing amicus briefs on behalf of the cities and state plaintiffs. Beyond that, in terms of the lawsuits themselves, and Abby just touched on the liability waiver, that is a concern at the federal level as well.
Yeah, and I guess I would add to that, Corey, that just the shaping of the federal bench has an enormous direct impact on this, and particularly to the ability for parties to get through the courthouse door. So the legal concept of standing, which means that the person bringing the suit or the entity has actually been harmed and is the right person to bring the suit, has been constricted considerably over the last decade or two, and makes these lawsuits more difficult even to get started on the substance of the suits. And so certainly the shape of the federal courts and the state courts have a real impact on that.
Yeah. Again, hopefully these lawsuits stay in state court where they've been filed and we don't have to deal with the federal standing issue. But you're right, that same concern exists at state court as well. And that's why it's important to vote up and down the ballot, not just for the president. Absolutely.
Another question had to do with the nature of the companies that are being hauled into court. Does it expand beyond oil and gas? Does it include coal? And if it doesn't, what sort of potential liability might there be for coal companies?
Yeah, so far it really is a focus on oil and gas. I do, Megan, maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong. I do believe that there has been a coal company or some companies that have their hand in both oil and gas and coal named in a couple of lawsuits, but the focus really has been, and I think part of it has to do with the attribution science that's been out there, and the narrative around who was most active in the deception campaign.
Megan, did you want to add anything to that?
Corey got it completely correctly. There are some cases that involve both oil and coal companies, but the majority of the focus has been on the oil companies.
Okay, Dan has a question, which is there a difference in likelihood of cases like these recovering from state-owned companies as opposed to investor-owned companies? So is there a difference between an ExxonMobil and a Gazprom or Pemex or National Iranian?
Well, yeah, there would be all sorts of different jurisdictional issues if we were talking about bringing in a company that was owned by a foreign national. But again, those companies have not been named in any of this litigation.
Okay. And then another question from Ernie is whether, why aren't states pursuing a class action suit against the major fossil fuel companies, similar to what was done with the tobacco companies?
So I'd say part of that answer, again, comes back to the desire of plaintiffs to have these claims heard in state court. That is for a number of reasons. I'd say most importantly, because of there was a kind of a first wave of climate litigation, if you will, earlier this century, the Kivalina case and the Comer case and the California versus General Motors case, where the cases were really focused on the greenhouse gas emissions. They were filed in federal court. The federal court said those claims, like a federal public nuisance claim, was displaced by the Clean Air Act, and thus the cases were all dismissed. So I think with this current wave of litigation, they want to avoid federal court as much as possible to not have that same fate. And if you were to do a mass class action like that, a multi-district litigation, I believe it would really have to be in federal court.
Jamie, do you have any thoughts on that? Yeah.
Yeah, let me just add to that. I mean, I think class actions generally now, because of what Congress did recently, end up in federal court. But I think the tobacco case, when the state sued, it wasn't a class action. It was each individual state in state court. And I think that's a doable model. But one of the complications now is that, like everything else, the attorneys general have become very polarized. And so there's a Republican Attorneys General Association, and I don't know the exact numbers, but it's probably more than half the states have Republican attorneys general who aren't interested in doing that sort of thing. I think that will change, sort of the way Medicaid expansion has changed when voters can push them and so on. But, the polarization politically is an obstacle to doing what ultimately might be a more effective approach.
Yeah, I know we're running up against the hour. I'm wondering if each of the panelists might have a last kind of parting thought that they want to people to take, and maybe we'll start in reverse and go with you, Rachel, and then work our way back up.
I guess for me, I guess I can sort of connect in with the audience members, where I have to say I remember coming, fresh to UCS, and this sort of topic of corporate responsibility was really different. We're really accustomed to thinking about the responsibility of countries and nation states. I had worked at the State Department previously, so that was kind of how I had come to know it. But I've really, in learning about the deception campaigns, feel very passionate that this is really an area that I think citizens can really push this issue and really help get climate action unstuck. So I'm really just grateful for everyone participating and excited that there's so much momentum and energy around this method of action. Thank
you, Rachel. Corey.
Yeah, I'll just echo Rachel's thanks there. Thank you all for attending this and your interest in holding this industry accountable. I guess my parting thought would be to normalize what's happening here. I think Jamie and Megan did a great job of describing how we've seen this before, and we've seen our judicial system work in holding these bad actors accountable. And it's the same thing here, despite what any Supreme Court justice might say about whether or not climate change is happening. We know it's happening, and the courts are here to help remedy the harm caused.
Thank you, Corey. Jamie.
Yeah, I don't have any great parting thoughts, but thank you all for attending. And I really do think the cases Corey went through are really exciting and hopefully are just the tip of the iceberg. Because I do think, for better or worse, litigation has been the one way in a lot of these areas you can move the ball.
Megan.
I think I would just encourage everyone to take part in the action that Abby shared and encourage your federal representatives to stand against a liability waiver. The industry will come to try to trade away access to the courts in exchange for any sort of regulation going forward. But there's no regulation on future conduct that can make up for the decades of denial and deception that have gotten us where we are today. So these cases are super important to protect, and definitely fill out the letter that Abby shared.
And Nellie, you get the last word.
I'm not sure I can say anything that anyone else hasn't already said, but yeah, everything that everyone else has said, and just educate yourselves on what you can do for your community, as well as voting for people who actually support protecting the environment and preserving it for future generations.
Great. Thanks, Nellie. All right, so I'm going to turn it over to Abby, who did all the work at pulling this together and did a great job. Thank you, Abby, on behalf of all of us. And on behalf of CLF, thank you all for being engaged. I think that's the most important thing, to be engaged at the local level like Nellie, or at the state level, or at the federal level. So be engaged, vote, and get everybody you know to vote. Over to you, Abby.
Thank you all so much. We are only 1 minute over the hour, which I feel like is amazing for packing 5 speakers and a Q&A into an hour. The last thing I'll also say to get involved is to spread the word. This is a recently new idea. Maine's municipalities are increasingly realizing the huge costs that they're facing and that their taxpayers are facing. And so spreading the word to municipal officials, to attorneys, to other folks in Maine to just let us know that this isn't an option of how Maine can help cover these costs. As I mentioned earlier, the video recording of this event will be emailed to you all later today. I will also, I can't include the slides, but email me back if you'd like the slides and I can send them to you one-on-one. I will also include that action form that I had sent through the chat for you to send to your federal representatives, asking them to support this work. And that is it. Thank you all so much again for joining us, and have a great rest of your day. Take care.